So if this does not smack you across the face, you're either asleep or you're dead or you're an angel in disguise. Because if this does not apply to everybody in this room, then something is seriously wrong. So, tongues and pickles and tongues. So, from 1984 to 1988, my family lived in Southern California. And we lived just La Crescenta. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of La Crescenta, but anyway, that's where we lived. And my stepfather at the time, he was working at the Southern California Conference office in Glendale. But twice a year, we would make the pilgrimage north to visit my grandparents, trying to escape the smog and the city and everything. And we would get in the car and we would drive straight nonstop up to my grandparents' house. It would take us about 24 hours to get there, give or take. And we would go to Farmington, Washington. Now, I've mentioned that before, but Farmington, if you've never been there, Farmington is this little dinky little town in eastern Washington, and it's right on the Idaho-Washington border. And you can barely see it, but there's the town water tower, and that was actually on my grandparents' property. And so they retired there from Grass Valley, California, and they moved up there in the summer of '84. And when they moved up there, they had this idea. My grandmother and my great aunt, who lived with my grandparents, they had always had this idea of having a big garden. They were going to live off the land, and they were going to have this big garden. Well, the first summer that they were there, they made the mistake of planting 27 zucchini plants. I'm taking it from your reaction. You've heard about zucchinis. But they made the mistake of, they never did that again, by the way. But they thought that, by having, living off the land and having the produce and stuff, they'd have this big garden, which they did. And they downsized it the next couple of years. But they ended up finding out that, the problem with living in a town like this, everybody had their own garden. And so they couldn't get rid of all this stuff. And so they had a barn, and they had a bunch of potatoes, and they put all the potatoes in the cellar of the barn, thinking that they would keep. They didn't keep. Well, they couldn't eat as many potatoes as they had. And so my grandfather, he had a very weak stomach. This is too much information, but anyway, he had a weak stomach, but I remember as a child, and I thought it was funny, but they would be walking by the barn. I remember he was helping my grandmother haul lumber. And, so they're both on the ends of boards, and they were walking past the barn. And my grandfather, who had a weak stomach, he'd be like, just from the smell of all the rotting potatoes coming out from underneath the barn. And my grandmother would always be like, Dale, hush up, kind of thing. Anyway. But in their garden, we, as a kid, loved going up to visit them. We would spend about a month at their house every summer. And we loved it because one of the things that my grandmother and my great aunt would do is they would take the cucumbers and they would turn them into pickles, right? And I love their homemade pickles because they'd put garlic in it, but they'd also put jalapeno peppers in the pickles. And I loved having these. They were good-sized pickles, but they had quite the little kick to them. And my stepbrother and I, we would sit there watching TV, chowing down on these pickles that had spice, kind of thing. And I just loved it. Anyway, so when we got time to go back home, my grandmother said, here, why don't you take a jar of pickles? You can take that home. And I was so excited to be able to take that jar of pickles home with me. So I went home with my jar of pickles. Came time for school to start, and I decided that I was going to take one of my grandmother's homemade pickles to school with me in my lunch. Now, in my 7th grade wisdom, I thought, well, if I just take the pickle in a Ziploc bag or whatever, that's not going to be very good because it will dry out by the time lunchtime comes. And so I know what I'll do. I'll take a Tupperware container and I'll pour the juice from the jar into the Tupperware container, and it will keep my pickle all fresh and moist and stuff for lunchtime. So that's what I did. Well, got to school, put the container in my desk, and when lunchtime came, I opened up my lid to my desk, and I looked at the container where the pickle was, and somehow it had leaked from morning until lunchtime, and the pickle juice had leaked out of the container, and the container was dry. And somehow, as best as I can figure out, is that the liquid had run out into my desk, and there was a small hole, not just a tiny little hole in the bottom of the desk, and the juice found its way out of that hole, down the leg of the desk, into the carpet underneath my desk. Now, fortunately, it was old carpet because they replaced the carpet at the end of that school year. But for the rest of that year, any time that you you opened the door of that classroom, guess what it smelled like? It smelled like pickles. All year long, that classroom had the faint odor of dill pickle, right? So I share that as an illustration of the fact that it was one pickle, one time, but the residue and the effects of that pickle lasted all year long until they changed the carpet during the summer. It's amazing. So I use that as an illustration to say that sometimes the words that we say, just an instant, right? Just an instant, but the impact and the residue of the impact of what we say can last a long, long time. In fact, our words can sometimes have the impact throughout eternity. So, how many of you have ever played the game telephone? Right? I tried this a couple weeks ago at school. It didn't work out really well, but you play the game of telephone or gossip, whatever you want to call it, where you have, you say one sentence to one person and they pass it down the line, and then the person at the end says out loud what they heard, right? And it's fun because you see the difference that it makes between the first person and the last person, right? How often does the sentence get passed down correctly from the first person to the end? Doesn't, right? Hardly ever does it pass down correctly, right? And you use that, it's funny and you all laugh and you have a good time about it. But the point is that we need to learn that when we pass information along, it's important for us to be able to tell the truth and to pay attention of what we are saying and what we are speaking. And even if, we have phone vite, we send out the prayer request, everybody gets it at the same time. But even though everybody gets the same message at the same time, it's amazing how many times people misunderstand what was said, right? And we'll get calls on the phone. What was that? I didn't understand what was said, right? And it is so true with the words that we say. Here's a quote here. It says, "You never know how long your words will stay in someone's mind, even long after you've forgotten you spoke them." I don't know how many of you can ever remember, if you think back, don't raise your hand, but if you think back to maybe elementary school, can you remember some unkind word or something that somebody said to you? It's amazing how long those things stick with us. We might, and then you think about some of the things that we might have said to somebody else. A lot of times we might forget what we've said, but the impact, the result that it had on the person that heard it, it stays with them for years and years to come. Psalm 141, verse 3, it says, set a guard over my mouth, Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips. I can't tell you how many times in the morning when I pray and say, Lord, I do not know the conversations that I'm going to have today. I do not know what is going to come up today. But Lord, please protect me from myself. Please watch over my mouth. I invite you to turn your Bibles to James chapter 3. James chapter 3, starting in verse 1. And I must tell you that the first couple of verses of this passage, it really terrifies me as a pastor, because he says, not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. When we put bits in the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by men. But no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Can we tame our tongue? Can we control what comes out of our mouth? What does James describe the tongue being? The tongue of fire, right? And you think about fire. Think about forest fires. Think about some of the forest fires that we have had in our area in the recent years, right? We don't have to think back too many years ago when the smoke was just awful, right? But how much does it take when the conditions are right? How much does it take for total destruction to take place? Not very much, right? And it doesn't take very long for a complete forest to be destroyed by fire. So we talk about our tongues and the impact that our words have on the people around us. Proverbs 26, verse 20. Without wood, a fire goes out. Without a gossip, a quarrel dies down. So we talk about being careful about the words that we say, but we also need to be careful about what we listen, right? And so many times if somebody has a habit of gossiping or whatever, it's also up to us who are listening to say, you know what, that's not something that I want to hear. I don't want to hear it, right? So we have to be careful what we say, but we also have to be careful about what we listen to. It says, without wood, a fire does what? goes out, right? So we need to be careful. Why does the Bible talk about, slander, gossiping, lying? Why is it such a serious issue to God? Think about everything that we encounter, all the negative things that we encounter in the world. Where did it start? It started with one person, Lucifer, up in heaven saying, God is unfair. Everything started with just one individual spreading rumors and gossip and lies. This led to this. God's character, everything we encounter, God's character is on trial because Satan said God is unfair. This is why it is so important that we take care about what we say. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 29 through 32 says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another. Doing what? Forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. It's so easy when we have been wronged, when somebody has done something against us, what is the first thing that we want to do? We want to tell somebody else, right? We want to feel vindicated. We want to feel justified and whatever from the hurt that we feel. We want to share it with somebody else so somebody else can say, oh, I'm so sorry, right? I mean, that's how we all feel. One of the stories in the Bible that I find fascinating is when Jesus was anointed, when his feet was anointed. You remember the story of Mary when she brought the gift? And what's interesting to me is not just the fact of her love and her sacrifice for Jesus, but you remember when she did that, how did the rest of the people in the room, how did they respond to her gift? They criticized her, right? They criticized her, they complained, they said it was a waste of money. Who said it was a waste of money? Judas. What was Judas doing at the time? He was taking money out of the collection, the money that the disciples had, their livelihood. He was stealing money out of that. So at one time he's stealing money out of the bag, but yet he's saying, oh, this is a waste of money. This should be given to the poor, right? Complete hypocrite. Who was the other person that was critical of the moment? Simon, right? And remember, he didn't say anything, but he said, surely if Jesus was a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this, Mary is. He would never let her touch him. Now you read Desire of Ages, and we find out, why was she led in her life of sin? Simon. So Simon was criticizing Mary, Judas was criticizing Mary, and there was only one person in that room that was innocent, who had never sinned, and he knew everything. He knew what Simon had done. He knew what Judas was doing. He could have very easily pulled back the curtain and exposed them right then and there in front of everybody else. But what does Jesus do? How does he relate to what they're saying? He gives them in parables. He talks to them in parables and stuff. So even though Jesus could have revealed their sin to everybody else, he chose not to. I think about that. How many times when somebody sins against us, how many times do we want to expose that sin to everybody else? Right? But yet we look at the example of Jesus, and Jesus says, you know what? I could do the same thing with you. I could expose all of your sin, but I choose not to. How many of you are thankful that God in his mercy has chosen not to expose your sin to everybody else in this room? Right? And God says, in the verses we just read, he says, be compassionate, forgiving one another as God in Jesus has forgiven you. We need to be careful about what we say. Proverbs 17, verse 9, whoever would foster love covers over an offense, but whoever repeats a matter separates close friends. Think of how many relationships, the whole course of history, could have been different in many, many different cases if people had simply guarded the words that they said. Strong people don't put others down. What do? They lift them up. Be an encourager. The world has plenty of critics already. Isn't that true? I mean, you could go on and on about that one alone. Proverbs 12, verses 18 and 19. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment. When we lived in Minnesota, in Central Time or whatever, the evening news was on just whenever we were having supper. And so we would sit there and we would watch Brian Williams on NBC Nightly News. Why is Brian Williams not on NBC News anymore? Does anybody remember? He lied. He got fired for lying. He said that he was over, I forget where he was, but he said that he was, I think it was Iraq or whatever, but he said that they were under attack and whatever. And people that were with him said, sorry, that's not true. And so they actually had to remove him from NBC Nightly News because of the fact that he lied. Now you think about it, think about, he was removed from his job because he lied. Think about our current state. Think about different, and I'm not, you could say Democrat, Republican, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? But you think about the different politicians right now that lie almost on a daily basis. We should go back and apologize to Richard Nixon, right? Because you think about what he did compared to what's happening today, Anyway, it just shows how our society has changed, because what was once considered unacceptable now has become common practice. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. Finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. Mean people are really just sad people. They hurt others because they are hurting. Every person is born beautiful, and much of the ugliness in others was put inside of them by other hurting people. If somebody has hurt you, chances are the reason why they have hurt you is because somebody has hurt them. So each one of us have a choice. Are we going to continue that pattern? We've been hurt. Are we going to hurt somebody else? Or are we going to make the decision to say, you know what, I'm going to stop it here and I'm not going to keep it going? You don't always have to tell your side of the story. Time will. There are so many times in my pastoral experience where we have, Anita and I, both of us, we have endured accusations and, whatever. And there have been times where it has been very, very painful because a lot of times this happened from people that at one point we considered very close friends. It is very hard and very painful to go through a time like that. Just to keep your mouth quiet and not say anything and not retaliate and just let time deal with it in its own. And I have found over and over again, if you just zip it, keep your mouth quiet and not repeat it, in time, things will, in most cases, resolve itself. But it's not easy. It's hard. Proverbs 17, verses 27 and 28. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. Even fools are thought wise if they do what? Keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues, right? You can't tell who is a fool if they don't say anything, right? But then when they start talking, then you're like, yeah. A few years ago, I did a funeral service in Duluth, and the lady's name was Ruby Erickson. And there's not many times where I go through or come out of a funeral saying, you know what, that was a really special event. It happens every once in a while, but Ruby's funeral was really special. It was one of the best funerals, if you can say that. It was one of the best funerals that I had been to because I really felt like I had been ministered as I listened to her friends share and relate testimonies about Ruby and the type of person that she was. God really spoke to my heart. And one of the things that they said, multiple people said, when they talked about Ruby, is they said, you know what, as I think about Ruby and everything that she said, I cannot recall a single negative word that Ruby ever said. I thought, wow, if people could only say that about me. Always positive, always cheerful, never said a negative word about anyone else. I am not much into bumper stickers. I enjoy sometimes. Sometimes I enjoy when I see bumper stickers on somebody else's car. But you can learn a lot about somebody, right? Simply from the bumper stickers on the back of their car. You can learn if they have what their political leanings are. You can learn if they have a sense of humor. You can sometimes learn where they went to school. Complete stranger, but you can tell a lot about that person simply by the words on the back of their car. And I use that as an illustration to say is, what do people learn about you by the words that you say? What do people find out about the type of person that you are by the words that come out of your mouth? Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. What is your heart full of? Because whatever your heart is full of, that's what is going to come out of your mouth. Is your heart full of God? You're going to talk about God. Is your heart full about your family? You're going to talk about your family. Whatever your heart is full of, that is what is going to come out of your mouth. If you're dissatisfied with the words that come out of your mouth, there is encouragement for all of us. Because God has given each one of a promise in Ezekiel 36:26. God says, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you. How many of you today desire to have that heart transformation, to have God plant a new heart in us so that our words will reflect what is in our heart?